I'm hearing from a lot of you in email, the synchronous session, or conversations during office hours that you don't know what to write about. You don't know what to say about the text that you're finding. You're finding cool passages, you're finding cool sentences from the novel, but don't know what to do with them. So I thought this lecture could focus on how to really zoom in on the level of specific words and unpack those words more fully. In other words, say a lot more about a lot less evidence. I think many of you actually have way too much evidence in your paragraph, and you're crowding your paragraph with language from Twain that you're not fully explaining. And looking at less of that language more fully would help you better explain Twain's argument. Let's give you an example of what I mean. If you focus on specific words, what you're doing is, instead of plopping in whole sentences, instead of narrating what's happening in the scene, you're zooming in on specific words and phrases that you want to unpack. And by zooming your lens in on this level, you can really say a lot more. And the magnifying glass or the microscope you want to use for this is actually a literary device, is actually a word like symbolism or metaphor or image or irony or paradox or all the different things we've been looking at. And then once you have that literary device, you use that as a guide to unpacking the language. If the word is symbolic, what is it symbolic of? How does that symbolism work? If the word is an image, what are the connotations of the image? If the passage explores an ironic discrepancy, what is that discrepancy? How does it work? If it's a metaphor, what's being compared to what? And how does Twain use that to make his argument? And this means that we're always connecting each word or device back to that claim. Twain is saying this. Here's how he uses these words to do that. Symbolism is the tool that he uses to make this point. Irony is the tool. Imagery is the tool, etc. Right, and then we get back to again and again to how does Twain use these words to make his argument. So let's look at an example. I was talking with Jen Rogers about her interest in human agency in chapter 28. And I just asked her what passages interested her. And as she read a couple sentences from the book, I just pulled out these words. Clothes and bearing, notable discrepancy, too much vigor. Another phrase that she used was too much decision. So as she was reading a longer quote, I was just pulling out a couple key words here or there. And this is the step I think that would really help you. If you stop and look at your quote before you start writing about it and pull out the words or pair of words that really resonate with you. And so I'm going to show you how I can start with these two pairs and write a pretty good analysis. And then, I can move on to these two pairs and provide more analysis and end up with a pretty huge paragraph. So here's what I wrote when I looked at the first pairs of words that Jen gave me. And notice how right away I'm using a literary device as my lever to unpack the term. So as soon as I can in my analysis, I want to use a word like symbolism or irony or imagery or metaphor, one of the things we've been talking about. So I indicate that symbolism is what I'm going to look here, and I'm going to talk about how Twain uses that symbolism to talk about the class system and how to talk about agency, right? And I play with that word noticeable discrepancy. I integrate it into the sentence with quotation marks. Same thing with clothes and bearing. So what I'm doing here right at the start is I'm presenting and labeling. This is the language I'm interested in. This is a term that I can use to apply it. And right away, you'll notice I'm linking right from the get-go. Oh, this is so frustrating. I'm linking right to the get-go the specific words to my claim. So I'm always explaining to the reader, what's the relationship between discrepancy, close and bearing, and agency? What's the relationship between Twain's language and my discussion, my claim, which is what he's saying about agency? So if you see in these first sentences, I'm doing a lot, right? I'm presenting, I'm labeling, and I'm connecting to the claim. And that's really important. In fact, let's go in and add that word connect, right, to what we're doing. So I'm connecting back to my claim. All right, and then instead of just moving on to the next quote, instead of assuming my reader understands those connections, I'm going to make what to me is obvious explicit. I'm going to say the unsaid. I'm going to make every connection and relationship clear. And I offer a couple sentences about how this works. Why is it that the discrepancy between the king's clothes and bearing is an indicator of how agency works for Twain, and how Twain sees class as determining our sense of agency? And I spend a couple of sentences just explaining those two little phrases that I've introduced. Now, you look at this, that's pretty good, but I don't know, that doesn't look like a whole paragraph. So, but I'm pretty far into it, and all I've done is talk about 4 words. Not 4 sentences, 4 words. Well, then let's go on and look at another set of words from the same passage and see what I can do with that. So again, I'm introducing my passage, and remember, I want to we want to add that word connect. So I'm entering these words: too much rigor, too much decision, and noticeable discrepancy. Now, what's cool here is noticeable discrepancy is a carryover from my previous discussion. So it links what I said about clothes and behavior to these words, too much rigor and too much decision. Again, I'm getting at the connection here. The king's attitudes and beliefs. All right? And so that gets at his sense of agency. And then I actually make explicit the idea of sense of agency in this next sentence. And I use one of our magic literary device words, connote. So I've presented some language, I've labeled it, I've connected it back to agency, and now I'm going to, again, spend a couple sentences explaining, interpreting, elaborating upon what I have said. So I'm presenting a small set of words, I'm labeling them as a literary device, I'm connecting that literary device, I'm using that literary device as an interpretive tool to explain the concept we're dealing with here, which is agency, and I'm explaining all those connections. I'm not just saying it's a connotation, I'm explaining what and how the language connotes what about human agency. So I hope this walkthrough process is helpful. You end up at the end with a pretty big chunk of language. This is a pretty big paragraph, and it still needs a claim sentence at the beginning. Because remember, we want a sentence that makes an argument. So if I work in an argument here, if I want to say something like, in chapter 28, Twain protests how class status determines human agency. Now I've added a sentence, a claim sentence, that clearly tells me what Twain's argument is, right? How does Twain feel about the tension between determinism and human agency, which is the tension here? Well, I've answered in this sentence, and I use both words. Determinism is there in the word human determines. Human agency is explicitly stated. In that very simple claim, I've set up this analysis of language that I've done, and I've clearly seen Twain's book as an argument about human agency. And if I see the book as an argument about human agency, then I can look, oh, I'm so sorry, folks. Then I can look at the language and how the language does that. So I could now change my language here to something more transitional, right? I could say, he does this symbolically, or he symbolically, how we do this? Just change it to, he symbolically presents how our upbringing in a class system shapes our attitudes. And there we go. So all I have to do once I've developed all this language, make a little minor transitional tweak there. Now I have a full paragraph. It starts off with a strong, simple, clear claim, and then continues into language analysis that presents, labels, explains, and let's not forget connects. So I hope this helps. I apologize for the glitches and the sniffles, but I don't have time to edit this for you, and I want to get it out to you so you can use these ideas as you work on your next draft. All right, see you in Canvas.